and sometimes people move on, sometimes they don't, but forgiveness is very hard, well, it is hard. It's necessary, but it can be very hard because you can be very mad, humiliated, think of all the negative words that come along with that. So what else did we talk about? Was that about
Well,
it?
I think that's worth pausing just for a second, because I do think like our failures or our sins or whatever it is that we're talking about, like one of the things we do learn about is forgiveness. Like what is that? Whether it means forgiving someone else, needing forgiveness, receiving forgiving ourselves, right? That everything that you're talking about, I think, is hugely important. Because I mean, we're gonna hear about Peter here in just a second, and like, I can only imagine, right? You can only imagine what kind of anguish he felt and the process he must have also gone through. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's a huge component. That forgiveness is very, very important in that regard.
Just remember, it's in the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, last comment, Tom, before we shift in.
Oh, I just remembered Don's wonderful story. He wanted to marry Penny, and then somebody else married her first, and but he divorced her, and then Don learned from his mistake and married Penny, and
A happy ending.
yeah,
That's
it
a
was a very wonderful story.
Serendipity.
Yeah. So
All right,
thank
well,
you for
that's-
sharing there, Don.
That's a big life lesson kind of thing. Well, could we pass that back to Don if he wants to make a comment?
I couldn't do much about her getting married because I was in Germany at the time.
Oh,
So
all
I
right.
wrote a letter saying I made this great mistake,
Okay.
but it was too late. The first time anyway.
But you make that mistake the second time, right?
No, I was not going to make that.
All right, that's great. All right, let's move forward then together. If I could get a volunteer to read our passage, and then we'll jump in together.
A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. But he said to them, the king of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you, just as my Father has conferred on me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay, all right, so let's jump in together. And I am going to try to collapse that just a tad. There we go. All right, so just to remind ourselves, we are in the Passion narrative. Jesus has entered into Jerusalem with the triumphal entry. I think it's chapter 21 or 20 is taken up with the series of interactions between Jesus and the religious authorities, particularly in Jerusalem, where the Pharisees are sort of replaced by the chief priests and scribes. So basically the temple elite become his primary opponents. One of the things that we noticed, and that will be important, but that will begin to blur as we move through this story, is that for all intents and purposes, in regard to Jesus at least, Jerusalem is sort of split, right? The elite, they don't like Jesus. They want to get rid of Jesus. They want to confront Jesus. The quote unquote people are delighted by some of the things that they're hearing. Okay. So that's been an important component. And this is actually an important piece, or I would maybe even say agenda in the way that Luke tells the story, as compared to the other gospels, because he really does go out of his way to emphasize that it is not the people so much who put Jesus to death as it is the leadership. And the role that the people play is in some ways, they become almost like puppets of the leadership. And so that's an important piece that we want to keep in mind. And one of the reasons why I do want to also highlight that is that I think tragically, when we think about the holy texts of our tradition, right, the Passion story is going to be central, right? This is Jesus going to the cross. And yet these texts have often been used to justify anti-Semitism because of the way that they're read. And so that's why we want to make sure that we're careful, especially in places where we notice that there are gospel authors who are not necessarily doing that. Jesus's public ministry ends with chapter 21, where we have this, what we call the synoptic apocalypse. It pretty much is material that shows up across the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke, there's a couple of small differences. We talked a little bit about that. And we talked about the placement of this synoptic. So the last words, in other words, the last public words of Jesus are, for all intents and purposes, apocalyptic words, right? That judgment is coming. He talks about the days of the Son of Man, the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem itself, etc. And I think one of the things that I tried to make clear to you was that not only is this about, potentially predicting future events, but there's a kind of setting of the tone that's happening, because once we enter into the Passion, we are also entering into an apocalyptic experience. So Jesus himself is about to undergo his own apocalyptic judgment. That's what the Passion is. It is his trial. And so the trial that he undergoes there, in a sense, is for the way at least the gospel authors tell it, is apocalyptic. Before we get to that, though, we have this very intimate scene of the Last Supper. And that's where we are. They have arranged to have a room. They have gone in, they're guests in Jerusalem, so they don't really have a place that's properly theirs to stay, so they need to rent a room. They do that, they gather together. The verses immediately preceding this set up for us the words of institution as Luke records them, and that is the scene. Now, one of the unique things about Luke in comparison to the other two synoptics, now John is very different. If you go in and you read John, you have a very extended teaching time at the table. That is not the case in Matthew and Mark. It's a much more truncated, shorter scene. Luke is similar to Matthew and Mark, but Luke does actually provide some what we might call table teachings. So there's some moments at the table where Jesus actually is instructing them, and that's where we have kind of parachuted in together. So this is a unique place in terms of Luke. One of the interesting things here, the way that in terms of some of the commentators, is they point out that particularly Luke is because I think that it'd be fair to say because of his Gentile audience, right? Because Luke is more than likely himself a Gentile. There's a general sense, given the place names and some of the language that he uses, and the fact that he talks about, imperial events, et cetera, that he's talking to Gentiles and not just to Jews. That the way that Jesus is portrayed, at least to some extent at the table, is that he comes off almost as a philosopher. So this feels a little bit like the last trial of Socrates, right? Which is an event that is recorded in Plato and Xenophon. So he's a philosopher figure here. That's going to be abandoned, by the way, eventually. I mean, eventually, even that parallel falls to the wayside because it doesn't do justice to what's actually happening. So that's kind of all background for us. And now we can kind of jump in and really start hitting the ground. And we start with verse 24. A dispute arose among them as to which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Now, if we took a few minutes and we read the material just before this, we have this profoundly intimate scene of Jesus offering up his body and his blood, only then for that to be followed by this, which is, interesting. It's in keeping to some extent with what we've heard as we've moved through the Gospels, which is the kind of the cluelessness to a certain extent of some of Jesus's closest followers, which we can, I think, take. I think there's so much to sit with in that regard. First of all, that the gospel authors and the communities behind them felt that it was absolutely necessary that the leadership be pictured as with their foibles, right? All of it is on the table. So like Jeff said yesterday, I think he made some mistake. And of course, I made a mistake by saying that there was April 31st, which there wasn't. It's only April 30th, as it turns out. There's only 30 days in April. We're not perfect, right? And I think the gospel text and the stories and these scenes here make that quite clear. So a dispute. Now, one of the things here that I do want to the only thing sort of worth bringing out, aside from just sort of you want to shake your head, is that this is not just like, hey, I'm pretty awesome. I'm more awesome than you. This is like a vigorous dispute. Like there is a like sharp words kind of thing that's going on here. So as I mentioned here, the grammar denotes really a very rather a contentious argument, right? And I don't think it takes much, to deduce from this the kind of irony that's on display, right? We're literally on the precipice of Jesus's passion, which I would suggest to you starts with the prayer scene. And what are the disciples arguing about? They're arguing about who's the greatest among them, right? They're not even in some ways thinking about what's coming for Jesus. They're thinking about what it means for them. Certainly, I suppose, a common human, foible, we might say, but unfortunate. I think the other thing worth noting here is even here we are on the eve of everything, and they still have not fully internalized what Jesus really is about. And I think if we include the book of Acts, as we're going to turn to the book of Acts next year in the fall, we will see that there still is working out and trying to figure out and understand what Jesus really was about. It takes time, and I love the fact that the gospel stories are pretty straightforward about that, because I think all of us know it takes time to try to figure out, well, what does it mean for us to follow Jesus? All right, so how does Jesus respond in a way that we, I think, are either familiar with or we wouldn't be surprised by? But he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader the one who serves, like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. All right. I mean, we could go into quite a bit of detail here about the way that the ancient world organized itself. I mean, when they talk about benefactors here, they're basically talking about what we could call the client patron structure, which was almost ubiquitous. So the ancient world was ruled by an honor shame dialectic, where you sought to either preserve or increase your honor and decrease or have no shame. And if you had shame, shame was kept at home. And this is oftentimes why this is gendered, where men are associated with honor and women are associated with shame. So Jesus literally is talking into a social reality that they know, right? He's saying that you are familiar with a world in which there are people on top and people on below, and who is the greater in that? typically it's people on top. And he's literally saying the way that you're going to be community together is to quite literally upend that, right? And so we hear that, right? That last verse is really the key one. I am among you as one who serves. And I suppose we could take the rest of the material there and think about that. So Jesus's own act of serving, this becomes the standard for leadership. And I think, we wouldn't probably be too, out of bounds to say this extends into the story that we're about to follow. I mean, Jesus, in a sense, is about to head to the cross as an act of service. At least that seems to be the way that he thinks about this. So again, in keeping with a basic theme that we've seen throughout the entirety of Luke's gospel, this notion of the first being the last, the upside down kingdom, etc. So it doesn't necessarily surprise us, Jesus's response, even if we might be a little bit surprised or maybe not surprised by the disciples. Then we get these verses here that I guess you can frame these in a couple different ways, but let me read these for us, starting in verse 28. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you, just as my Father has conferred on me, a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. All right. Now, as I'm trying to get us to the end of Luke, I've tried to avoid getting overly belaboring in some of these sections. So this is another one of those kind of, I think, somewhat enigmatic. This is clearly also a response to their concern about what their role is going to be, on the one hand, number one. But it is also dressed up in language that I think needs to be parsed out pretty significantly. Because Jesus himself has embodied God's kingdom throughout the whole of his ministry. And that has been a kingdom of service, right? I mean, that's essentially what it has been. And so this, I think, even though it sounds like more typical, like a more typical rendering of what kingdom work and what it would mean to be a king would be to like lord it over people. And so you could read these verses in that way. In other words, you could read these verses as literally undoing the verses just before them. But I think if we sit with them and we sit with the way that Jesus has talked about the kingdom and has embodied the kingdom, we come to realize that actually, even in these words, he is basically underlining what he has just said. Your work of being the church is going to be a work that looks an awful lot like my work. Right, a work of service. All right, so one of the things though that I did want to highlight was verse 28, especially given what's about to come. You are those who have stood by me in my trials. Obviously, Jesus knows, because he's literally about to say that they're going to abandon him, and in particular Simon, right? And yet here at this moment, he is reinforcing that even in the light of their failures that are to come, those are not things that disqualify them as his companions, right? So to be a companion of Jesus is not to be someone who doesn't fail. It's rather it's someone who trusts in God's mercy and grace. Right? That's what it means to be a companion of Jesus, someone who serves. So even though, and I have up here, right, the disciples, we could read this as, number one, simply an affirmation of the past, the trials, that language of trials, that Jesus could simply be saying, you're the folks who've been with me all along the way as I've moved through. And so you're going to receive this, such and such a reward. But I think given the fact that we're about to enter into a time when they are in fact going to abandon Jesus, it seems to me that this is also an affirmation, again, as I said before, that failure does not necessarily disqualify. And I think that's, to me, should be a word of comfort for all of us. He then gives us the Son of Man judgment material. As I say here, as the Son of Man appears, meaning judgment or setting right, so also the community is going to be commissioned in this regard. What has Jesus said about himself throughout the entirety of his ministry? He's the Son of Man. So his whole life, in a sense, is a judgment. But what kind of judgment? I mean, typically when someone who's living, he's living in this way of love, he's living in this way of justice. When you're confronted by this, it will expose you, right, to the places where you are not quite standing up. And so that's where, and I'm kind of like, I feel like I'm kind of like, let me just name the elephant in the room. Elgin hates judgment, right? You and I talk about judgment a lot when we have, like, it bothers you, right? This notion of judgment and judging and being judged. And so I'm trying to like maneuver through some of this to think about, well, what would it mean? How can we talk about that language, but not in the sort of the typical way, right, that it comes across? And I think one of the things that we have seen, I mean, Jesus's favorite descriptor of himself is Son of Man. Son of Man only appears when judgment is happening. So his life is a judgment. And it's not just the fact that he goes to the cross. It's the way that he loves the poor. That's a judgment. It's the way that he cares for women. That's a judgment. It's the way that he sets people free. That too is a judgment. But these are all clearly judgments that set people free. These are all clearly judgments that are in service to life rather than death. And so that is how I would unpack those verses 28 through 30, if we had kind of a little bit more time to work with that. Let me stop for a second, because I hope I haven't confused everybody. And I'm sure there might be comments that need to come out from the floor. Elgin.
He's got the microphone. See, that's what happens if you keep that right.
Let me just stop there for a second and see what kind of.
I have a question. Luke uses that passage on 24 twice. So it's got to be important to him. And why would he do that? Why would he want to expose the culture of the disciples in this negative way? What's the motivation to do it twice?
What do you mean twice?
Well, he does it in chapter 9 too.
Yes. And then of course we get the story with Simon Peter, and we get disputes that break out in Acts, etc.
Well, we get the idea of who's going to be greatest. I mean, that's kind of a negative
Right.
culture.
Well, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking a question.
Well, but surely you have some idea, some inklings. I mean, why would Luke expose this? Why would this be
I don't know.
preserved as part of the story of Jesus? I mean, I think I could think of a few things off the top of my head. I mean, one, obviously, Luke is not just writing for Luke. Luke writes as a member of a community. So he may be addressing some issues in his own community. That could be a possibility. That feels a little bit like conjecture, but certainly that could be a possibility. And there have been whole tomes written around that issue. I think number two is, I mean, I view it as a kind of decentering of the way that we typically think about leadership. We put an awful lot of investment, right, in a single person or a single structure. And in a sense, it's the Spirit, right, who's supposed to be the one leading, or it's Jesus who's supposed to be the one who's leading. Now, how do you do that? That's very difficult. It has to be worked out, minute by minute. But one way that you remind yourself that you need to do it that way is by realizing that you're not God, that none of the leaders are God, right? That they have foibles, that in fact, they are capable of actually doing the very things that Jesus often critiques, quote unquote, the outsiders. I mean, you could also, then the third thing could be, the attacks and assaults on the Pharisees, right, or the other religious elite, that stuff can also be replicated inside the church. And there's a wonderful, like I have this this guy that I do a lot of my research on in Germany. One of his favorite, or I wouldn't say one of his favorite, but one of my favorite of his aphorisms is, when God sets up the church, the devil sets up, you know, a church right outside. But then he qualifies it. He says, no, actually, the devil comes inside and sets up his own church right in the pulpit. And that every community is a mixture, basically. It's kind of his, those would be things that I would sort of throw out as things to consider. But Don, you had I think you had your hand up. I mean, it's heady stuff.
Usually what I've been told before is whenever something's repeated, it's important.
Yes,
Uh,
which I think was Elgin's
Yeah,
point.
yeah. And so that, yeah. That, you know, when it's trying to get your attention.
Right, that's right. Oh, wait, go back over to Don.
Is he not preparing his disciples for leadership also in his teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, absolutely. I think everything here is deliberate about, you know, prepping them for what's coming, the trials they're going to face. I mean, that's why I see, that's why, honestly, I think whatever we think about the enigmatic nature of verses 28 through 30, like what exactly is Jesus talking about, giving him a kingdom? I mean, there are bases for that, of course, in the Old Testament, et cetera. All of that, in a sense, I think is like a shot of confidence in the arm. Like, you are all going to fail. But that is, again, not supposed to be what ultimately defines you. You have been with me, you have been my compatriots, right? You have been my friends, essentially, to use the language from John's gospel. Oh, can we send over here? Thanks, Don.
Well, I'll preface it by saying I hate to be stupid, but this is, I can't remember when he's made references to the Gentiles. Usually it's been to the Pharisees.
Oh,
Uh,
Luke.
And the scribes. Well, yeah. Why is all of a sudden he's talking about the Gentiles?
Good luck.
Because actually the Gentiles, when it came right down to it, they're the ones that got the church going. Well,
Oh, you mean this comment here
yeah, he
in
says
verse
the
25?
king of the Gentiles.
Yeah, the kings of the
So I just
to me, I think that's a reference to that broader social order of patrons and clients.
Okay.
And what that means is that in the ancient world, the way that you accessed power, money, opportunity, and other kinds of things is that you associated yourself with a patron. And that patron, and you had to do certain things, like there's, when I was reading through on this, I can't remember what it was in reference to, but there was an example of clients of a particular patron in a particular city would get up in the morning and go to the front gate of where the patron lived. And as the patron came out, they would sing his praises. And they would walk with him, kind of forming an entourage as he made his way through the city. And the bigger your entourage, the greater your honor, right? And so in order to maintain that entourage, what does the patron do? He gives out a little bit here to this client, a little bit there to that client, et cetera. But he's in charge, right? He's on top. And so this imagery of the kings of the Gentiles and this language of benefaction is not just about actual kings. It's literally about the way that, like, for, again, totally anachronistically, the way that the upper, middle, and lower classes were actually structured in the ancient world. Like, we have a little bit more of a flat, but there is still some, like, I mean, literally, what is it? Who you know, right? It's who you know. That you get a job by who you know, like network. We use the language of networking. it's a similar kind of thing, but in those days it was even more, you owe someone pretty profoundly, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. The outsiders, foreigners, other nations. Exactly. That's right. All right, let me move us forward.
Christian, could I just say one thing?
Yes.
In this, it says, but the greatest among you must become the youngest. Why did they change? I like the word least. It used to be the greatest among you must be the least among you. Is this just a different? Because the youngest, they're acting like toddlers, they're acting like children. And to be youngest is to be a child in a negative way right here. So I like the word least, which means servant, because servant is least.
Yeah.
Is that too particular?
Not necessarily. I mean, you basically have the same idea iterated twice in that verse. So in that second section, the greatest must become like the youngest, the leader like one who serves, right? So those are two statements meant to reinforce each other. I think the former is operating with the idea that elder was typically more powerful. And
Okay.
so that's kind of the way that they're using it, but it does basically resonate with the point that you're trying to make. But I didn't have, unfortunately, enough time to go into the sort of the grammar there and why that shows up, because it is true that it has greatest here and then youngest, and even that comparison seems to be a little bit off. But like I said, I
Okay.
didn't. Yeah, great.
Thank you.
point.
It just kind of hit me with the word change.
Yeah, for sure. Is it children? You must like become like a child. Yeah. So it's literally almost a restatement, basically, chapter 9. And think about that. Chapter 9 is at the very beginning of the journey story, right? And they still haven't gotten it. Kind of interesting. Okay. All right. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to read our Simon passage? All right.
Sure. Simon, Simon, listen. Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And he said to them, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied 3 times that you know me. He said to them, when I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, no, not a thing. He said to them, but now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag. And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you, this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was counted among the lawless. Indeed, what is written about me is being fulfilled. They said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. He replied, it is enough.
All right. Here we go.
Wow.
Yeah, you just want to jump over to 39. Okay, well, let's and I don't necessarily belabor this. I mostly focus, by the way, on the first section with Simon Peter. I'll have a couple comments for the second one, partly because it's a bit enigmatic, but I do think there is a way of understanding what's going on here, especially if it's put into relationship to some other passages. So one thing to note, of course, this is a very famous story in the Passion narrative. And for me, at least, as I've been going through and prepping this material and doing the reading and stuff, I have been struck by, and the commentators are particularly adroit at doing this. They point out the differences between the different accounts in the Passion story. So there's some differences on the charges that are brought up against Jesus between the Gospels, or there's differences in certain kinds of scenes etc. So there's these little differences here and there, these discrepancies, or maybe even contradictions, we might, depending on your perspective. But there's also clearly places where there's like it maps on precisely. And this is one of those, right? Where Jesus predicts that Peter will in fact betray him. The nature, of course, of that, 3 times versus 2, etc. The cock will not crow this day until you've denied me 3 times. Or there's another rendering, the cock will throw before it crows 3 times, you will have, etc. Those are the discrepancies. But we still have this story. One of the differences, though, is, of course, as I say up here, that Luke places this interaction not in the garden, but at the table. So the table scene, right, this teaching element is important for him. Obviously, the retention of this scene in all the Gospels makes it very important. And I think this comes back to like Elgin's question, why is this here? Like, why make so much about, and think about Simon Peter plays kind of an outsized role among the disciples, right? Eventually it becomes the basis for first among equals, even though Peter never describes himself that way as far as we know. So I think the only, at least it seems to me, the safest thing to take away here is a kind of self-critical honesty about the foibles and the limitations of church leadership, basically, it seems to me, which I think is pretty healthy. And actually, I don't know if it's unique. I didn't really get a chance to kind of think about that in comparison to other sort of religious movements. It might be. Certainly, it's not unique to Judaism, because you just have to read the Old Testament and you get plenty of stories like this. So it could be in keeping simply with that. I don't know. We do, though, get here an interesting, right, sort of contrast, right? So let me read through here, and this contrasts back to the scene just prior to where we took up. So Simon, Simon, listen, Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And he said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied me 3 times that you know me. Now, earlier, so if Simon Peter's failure is in all of the Gospels and is obviously important, so also is Judas and his role in handing Jesus over. And I think however we want to think about this, it's pretty clear that there's a kind of contrast, it seems to me, at play here. And the contrast, we could probably parse it out in different ways. I think one of the most helpful ways is, in a sense, that Judas doesn't learn from his mistake, right? I mean, that would be, I don't know, maybe that's too easy of like letting him off the hook, whereas Simon Peter does, right? But both of them make very serious errors. I mean, both of them effectively betray Jesus. Judas is, of course, is the more serious as the story unfolds, as we know. So there is a contrast built in here. It's not precise because of the nature of their failures, but I do think it's worth noting that, right? So what's what are the similarities and what's the contrast? Well, the similarities, right? Both Judas and Peter are insiders. They're part of the 12. And I mean, this year, as we were going through Holy Week, I was struck yet again that Judas is present while Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, which means that Jesus washes Judas's feet, which means, of course, also that Jesus eats his last meal with one of his enemies, effectively, right? I mean, all of that is it's almost like there's no words, right? So both are present at the covenantal meal, and both are going to turn away from Jesus in their own way, in different ways. So those are sort of the similarities. Of course, the key contrast is that for Peter, this is not necessarily going to spell the end. right? I mean, that's what we hear in Jesus's words, right? Satan has demanded to sift all of you, but I've prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. Now, that's an interesting phrasing, right? Because in some ways his faith fails if we only think of faith as like something that precedes the event, as opposed to something that almost is like an umbrella. Because what happens? Peter comes back round, right? Even though in some ways he, quote unquote, we might say, lets go of, loses the rope, loses his faith, etc. His faith doesn't lose him, right? I mean, that could be one way of thinking about it. So I think there's a lot of ways to kind of consider this. Greatest versus least. I'm not sure why this is in my outline. This is the first time. Oh, okay. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, so we've just heard, and this is kind of an interesting thing, and it also sort of feeds back into what we've just heard about. And what did we just hear about? We heard about what is leadership going to look like. It's going to look like the least serve, like the greatest becoming like the least, right? Serving others. Well, what is a leader not supposed to do? Fail in that way, right? So in some ways, like Peter is in a way being configured as an outsider, as a sinner, right? A chief of sinners is Paul's language. So he almost takes up the place, right, of becoming one of the least. And as I say here, and Jesus makes this pretty clear, he's going to play a major role in helping to strengthen his other companions, but he's not going to be able to avoid his failure. And in a way, like you could sit with this actually, and you would see a very interesting parallel with Jesus himself, that Jesus also is going to be renewed and rescued, etc. But that does not mean that he's not going to have to go through the hell of the cross, right? That's kind of the way. And I mean, like if you wanted to look for sort of an interesting connection. Yes.
Just something that's been, as you put up Judas, Peter and Judas there, you know, but basically, I believe even Judas could have been restored.
Right.
As long as there's life, there's room for repentance.
That's right. Yeah, and there's a whole like fascinating like reflection on Judas. There's a Gospel of Judas, if you probably heard of, which was more than likely a Gnostic gospel written in the 2nd century, in which Judas is. I mean, there was even a tradition, I think, a messianic tradition, where the Messiah has to be betrayed, and the one who betrays is in some sense, in all intents and purposes, a servant of the Messiah in the act of betrayal. Like, there's all kinds of very interesting things about, and the real question is this: how far does God's mercy extend? That's the deep question. And I think for many people, not everyone obviously, but many people would say it doesn't end. And therefore it also could capture and grasp hold of and restore someone even like Judas. But yeah. All right, then we get the interesting text. This is sort of the end here before we move into the sort of really into the passion itself, in a sense, verses 35 through 38. He said to them, "When I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything?" They said, "No, not a thing." He said to them, "But now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag. And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you, this scripture must be fulfilled in me." And he was counted among the lawless, and indeed what is written about me is being fulfilled. They said, "Lord, look, here are 2 swords." He replied, "It is enough." All right. Let me like make a kind of generalized comment about what I think are happening in these verses. And then let's like the very, I would say pretty problematic section part, which is like Jesus telling people to buy swords, which is kind of a weird, very weird thing to hear Jesus saying. And so what exactly seems like is going on there? And I'll give you one interpretive option that's been used. I think on the whole, what you could say that these verses are doing is they are further changing the tone of what's about to happen. Like Jesus is impressing upon his disciples that I sent you out before with nothing, and all you were put in a position where you needed to rely on the hospitality of others. But now the situation is about to turn, and you need to actually be prepared as you go out, as you move in. Things are going to get darker, in other words. And so as I put up here, things are getting darker as we enter into this this night of the Passion. And no quarter is going to be given. And therefore, in a sense, they should not expect the hospitality that they had hoped and expected before. And remember, Luke is unique in that we have two sending stories in Luke. First, he sends out the disciples, then he sends out the 70. So that was clearly important for him. So we're coming back around to like, this is part of the mission of the church. Or at least, you could either extend this into the mission of the church, or you could say this only has to do with what's about to unfold here in the next day and a half in the story of Jesus. Okay, what do we do with the selling and buying and purchasing of swords? Okay, there's a whole tradition, obviously, of using these verses to justify writing Bible verses on bullets. So let's just get that out of the way. It can be read that way. It has been read that way. I think, though, I'm going to make an argument that this is purely symbolic. That the words that Jesus is using here, that these are not actual instructions per se. They are symbolic. And they have to do with this description of Jesus as a person being a lawless one. And I think most of the scholarship and the commentators argue that to carry a sword, if you were not legitimated by the authorities, was a questionable sign. People didn't walk around carrying swords. And so to have one and not be properly, authorized to do that as a soldier or whatever, made you into someone who was outside of the law. And so, as he says here in verse 36, but now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag, and the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you, this scripture must be fulfilled with me, and this is the one. And he was counted among the lawless. So this is literally the symbol of being lawless, as opposed to taking up a sword to live that way. The other piece of this that I would bring in is a set of verses we're about to encounter, which is when one of the disciples draws the sword and cuts off the ear, what does Jesus say? Stop. This is not who I am. This is not what I'm about. So you can read this, I guess, irresponsibly and say you should write Bible verses on your bullets. But I would suggest to you that would be taking the Lord's name in vain or something close to it, as opposed to what I think is going on here, which is basically a recognition that as things get darker, you are going to be perceived as one who lives outside of the normal state of affairs. It's not just that it gets darker because people are going to treat you badly. It's that they're going to perceive you as being a threat, essentially. And that's really is. I mean, if we look at all the things we've been hearing, to a certain extent, the gospel community is a threat. And as we move into the book of Acts, we see that happen in several vignettes. I think there was a question Elgin had. Did you want to pass that back?
I don't know if this helps, but the note on my Bible says the sword apparently meant to Jesus a preparation to live by one's own resources. Is that?
Yeah, that's another, that's an additional, that as like as a hunting instrument or,
Against hostility,
okay,
live by one's own resources against hostility.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even that, right? I mean, the other reason why I think we have a really hard time, if we're just talking about what this probably meant in its time, as opposed to what it might mean for us today, which are distinct, even though they're connected, hopefully. The early church up until about the 300s was predominantly pacifist. I mean, they actually flee Jerusalem out of pacifist convictions because they're not going to fight the Romans. They get into trouble with their Jewish compatriots for that. So if you have a church, and there are like council records, there are the Didache, the Apostolic Constitutions. I mean, these are all documents that are being produced in the 1st and 2nd century, all of which make clear that not only are Christians supposed to be pacifists, they're not even supposed to have jobs that put them in places where they would not be able to fulfill that calling. So if that is the overwhelming conviction of the earliest of the communities, it would just make no sense to read this verse as a sort of justification for something that sometimes it has been read for. I think we would be better to see it the way you're talking about or the way that I've suggested it. Let me stop for a second and see, are there any comments online? Okay. My dad stayed, but his screen went completely black. All right. All right, let's do, you have a few minutes here, so let's try our best to get through this. You know, maybe we should stop actually, because I do have we do have a, you guys want to stop or you want to, since we're so close? All right. Let's do that. I would like to ask you to be praying about next fall. I am exploring the possibility of us moving over to Friendship Village to maybe have our group in a bigger room over at Friendship Village. There's a lot of folks in our community that are at Friendship Village. There's some people who, like Lynn Teschendorf, for instance, who would love to come here, but I don't think she can, that she might be able to join us. Right. And we could also open this up to anyone else at Friendship Village as well. So I want you to please be praying for that, just so that we can kind of, because I would love to be able to also offer this, continue to offer it online and all that kind of stuff. And I don't see why that should be a problem, but yeah. Yeah, I think so. Apparently there's something that, yeah, supposedly this is going to help me. So I don't know yet. We'll see. But yeah. I'll have to bring my doohickey.
They have a lot of people with comments.
Yeah, well, and I think I was talking to Jane Bowler, and she said they have AV, their rooms are well equipped. I think we just need to figure out, make sure that they have really good Wi-Fi. And I don't know. I will, that's going to be one of the challenges. I mean, it's not that far from us. No. Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to figure out how to. Right. If you were coming from here, there's a couple of back roads that you can take. So
once you get out of this wireless area, it becomes natural.
yeah,
But for the first time, it's kind of confusing.
it can be. It can be very. Yeah. Huh? That's the other. That'll be my other question as I kind of talk with them.
We can't hear the questions.
Oh, they're asking about parking and some of those kinds of issues, Diane, around if we wind up over at Friendship Village, but
I think Friendship Village sounds like a good idea if they're willing to open the door, because Colonial has had meetings at Friendship Village over the years. And it wouldn't be anything all that new.
No, I don't think so at all. Parking's a problem.
Parking is an issue.
And I think we can change a little bit of like maybe our format, you know, I still love to do this because it gives me a lot of life to prepare it for you, but it might be more than you need. I don't know. So we'll figure that out.
There's more people that live there that come than us. Parking is really, yeah, but.
Right.
sometimes I go on with kind of their famous program there,
Yeah,
and yeah, it's.
yeah,
By room.
right, right.
But that's only happening.
Can't hear their comments.
Well, Terry's just like telling a joke. He's telling a dirty joke.
Oh,
So, no.
I'll pass.
I'm just kidding, Diane. I didn't want it to be recorded.
I'll pass.
All right, who has the mic? Elgin, would you mind praying us out? And let's as you pray for us, so we're thinking about Dick Smoker's family.
Dick Smoker, he used to sit kind of right here. And his daughter Kim came with it, and her husband is in cancer treatment, so that family's been.
Yeah.
If we want to pray for Don, who's having surgery on Friday.
Yeah. Yeah. And then don't we have some other surgeries going on?
The one that has the.
Gene, are you?
Pre-cancer check,
Okay, all right. I
looks terrible.
Well, I know Bruce Moody is having his knee replaced, and Frank, are you having something done on your, like a hip?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Oh, it's Don Cook. I'm sorry.
Are you sure, Frank?
Are you sure, Frank? Because you've been kind of wobbly.
Yeah.
Just go along with whatever he says.
Okay, all right. All right, thanks, Elgin. You play for us.
Father, we thank you for being here together. We thank you for Christian and his leadership and his knowledge, and sharing that with us. We thank you for this Holy Week that we've come through and all it's done for this church and the vitality that it shows and the love that seems to be there amongst us. Help us all to gather together to take your message and your love to others. We ask that you watch over Don and his surgery, and that you be with the Smoker family in their time of sorrow and hurt. You bless us in so many ways. You teach us to be the least and not the greatest. Help us to hear those words and to apply them to our world. In your name, amen.
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 Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Also pray